It's my pleasure to welcome you to the annual Mayor David N. Dinkins Forum, and it's my honor to introduce our interim dean, Robert C. Lieberman, who is the interim dean of the School of International and Public Affairs, as well as a professor of political science and public affairs here at Columbia. So please join me in welcoming Dean Lieberman.
Thanks, Dorian. On behalf of Columbia and the School of International Affairs, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the 16th annual David N. Dinkins Leadership and Public Policy Forum here at SIPA. And this year, as you know, the topic of our discussion for the morning will be gun control, which is, of course, not only an extremely important, urgent public issue, but, of course, also extremely timely. So I'm really excited and delighted that we're gathered here today to hear some important voices on this critical issue. I just want to acknowledge a few people. First of all, I want to welcome our guest mayor, Marc Morial, the president and CEO of the National Urban League. You'll hear from him later, and the former mayor of New Orleans. And all of our distinguished guests and speakers today. I think you're in for a really exciting, very illuminating morning of tough comments and an important discussion. I also want to thank Professor Esther Fuchs, who is the leader, intellectual and otherwise, of our urban studies program here at the school. The continuation of this forum and the building of our program in urban studies here at SIPA is due largely to Esther's efforts. Professor Christina Ford, another colleague in the urban policy program, and of course Carol Banks, who coordinates everything and whom you all know. So thanks to you all for being here. Thanks for your work in putting this together. The Dinkins Forum, like other things we do throughout the year here at SIPA, is a key component of the program and the education we offer here at the school. Through this forum and through the long-time influence that Mayor Dinkins has had here at Columbia, both during his long service in public service and his years here on the faculty as a colleague, have given us a prominent place in key debates on critical issues in urban public policy, and we're delighted to continue that tradition here today. Over the years at the Dinkins Forum, we've had the pleasure of hosting top leaders and policymakers, including the current mayor of New York, Mayor Michael Bloomberg, former Senator and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Henry Cisneros. And it's through the willingness of people like these to participate in this forum that has made the Dinkins Forum over the years such a stimulating and important part of our program. We think that Columbia University and the academic world are the perfect place to have such conversations where we can bring together practitioners, scholars, and people who have seen a set of issues from a variety of different perspectives to have a free and open dialogue on some of these most urgent and pressing and critical issues of our time. So without any further ado, it's my great honor and privilege to introduce, with all due apologies to Mayor Morial, when we say the mayor in this building, there's only one man who we mean. That is my colleague, the professor in the practice of public affairs at SIPA, the 106th mayor of New York City, David N. Dinkins.
You know, I've been meaning to ask somebody who this is. But you will note that he has a double-breasted jacket and a bow tie. Now, I don't know who this is. Does anybody know who this is? Is that who it is? Cat had style. I thank you all for coming. I see so many friends here that I have to resist an impulse to call all their names. But as I say so often, that here in New York we are frequently in the company of African diplomats, and they have a custom instead of acknowledging Herb Sturz and Carl Weisbrod, Skip Hartman, and instead of doing that, they say usual protocols observed. That means all you important people have been acknowledged. I'm very pleased to see so many of you here, happy to see students here, because the future really belongs to you. You are our future. And as I want to say that we old folks, we don't own the planet, we hold it in trust for you. So it's good that you're here. So thank you, Dean. Thank you for joining us for my 16th Annual Leadership and Public Policy Forum. I've been doing this since I lost my other job and got evicted from public housing. But it's been nice. I know that you're all anxious to hear from our keynote speaker, my friend Marc Morial, on this forum's topic of gun violence in our cities, and to exchange ideas with our excellent roundtable, so I'll keep my remarks uncharacteristically brief. I will begin by thanking Dean Lieberman for hosting our gathering again this year and giving us the opportunity to bring such great programs to SIPA. We also thank the Dean for his role this past year in keeping our school on course toward its goal of grooming global leaders and of equipping them with such a solid grounding in the theoretical and conceptual foundations of urban planning and politics, and in the practical application of the theories and concepts. So thank you, Dean. As you know, the topic of our 16th forum centers on the challenges facing our cities in this latest battle in the continuing struggle to protect our citizens from the harmful, too often deadly effects of gun violence. And we have assembled quite an outstanding group to help us address these issues. We're fortunate indeed to have with us today a group of individuals, all expert in their fields, who recognize the profound implications of gun violence and gun laws in this country, and have devoted a significant part of their professional skills, and I might add their personal commitment, to bearing the issues, joining the discourse, and taking action, whether in the arenas of public policy, in the courts, in the court of public opinion, or on the streets of our cities. I should note that one of our roundtable, Commissioner Ray Kelly, I don't call him commissioner. I have, to this day, I call him colonel, because he was a colonel in the Marine Corps and I was a private first class. So it seems to me that, so I always call him colonel. But he's been called away on more urgent business this morning, but has asked his right hand and the highest ranking uniformed member of the NYPD, Chief Philip Banks, to represent the department this morning. Congratulations, Chief, on your elevation. I told him, look at him, how young he is. This is the chief of the department, you understand. There is nobody above him except the commissioner. Look at him. Look. Telling you. We've also learned that my brother, Congressman Charles Rangel, representative of the university's district, will join us later to comment on the legislative maneuverings in Washington on this issue. We're grateful to have them both with us this morning and are anxious to hear what they have to say. We are especially pleased to have with us today the president of the Citizens Crime Commission, Richard Aborn, one of this city's most vocal activists in the fight for gun control legislation, and New York City's criminal justice coordinator, John Feinblatt, a key figure in the advocacy efforts of the national organization Mayors Against Illegal Guns, which is co-chaired by Mayor Michael Bloomberg. We've also enlisted the assistance of two of Columbia's finest teachers and scholars, one of whom you've just heard from, Dorian Warren, and Christina Ford, to keep the program moving this morning. Professor Warren has generously volunteered his time to bringing these forums for several years and has always contributed a thoughtful, cutting-edge perspective in our planning process. Those of you who have not yet had the good fortune of sitting in his classrooms may recognize Professor Warren as a frequent guest analyst on MSNBC. He When I see him, I said, "Good to see you live," because I see him on television so often. Professor Ford, a recent and welcome addition to the SIPA faculty, transitions back into academia after years of public service in the city of New Orleans, where she served as director of city planning under the keynote speaker, former New Orleans Mayor Marc Morial. I keep looking in the back because I anticipate the arrival of my bride. She told me she was coming this morning, and we've been nuptialated for 60 years come August, so I'm just trying to make some points this morning by having her here. At the conclusion of Mayor Morial's remarks, Professor Ford has agreed to share her historical perspective of his gun control posture and to facilitate the questions you may have after his presentation. We thank them all for taking time to share your experience, views, insights, and analyses with us this morning. Our panelists will shortly be properly and thoroughly introduced by a moderator of today's roundtable discussion, my friend Dr. Esther Fuchs, Professor of Public Affairs and Political Science and Director of the Urban and Social Policy Program at SIPA. Pardon me. She and I often say to each other and to others that people see SIPA and they think of it as international. Well, it is. And we do have a global outreach, but it's also public policy. The name of Columbia University is Columbia University in the city of New York. That's the formal name. And what better laboratory than the city of New York for some of these kinds of things? So Esther and I that's sort of our thing, Dean. We are on that, and I think it's so very important. Professor Fuchs is one of SIPA's most prolific scholars and practitioners, and she gave life to this forum some 17 years ago as founding director of the Center for Urban Research and Policy, and she has consistently played the major role in bringing the most compelling public policy issues to the floor for an airing through this forum and a very popular series of public policy lectures. She's no stranger to the inner workings of city government, having served as Mayor Bloomberg's special advisor for governance and strategic planning through his first term in office. And if her resume reads as if it's been taken from who's who in urban policy, that's because it has. SIPA students are fortunate to receive the benefit of her knowledge and her experience in guiding their studies in our urban and social policy program. And I thank my friend for conceptualizing the topic of this forum and refining upon the issues so that we can focus our discussion. And we are most grateful to her for enlisting the participation of such a distinguished group of experts to inform today's dialogue. Following the discussion, we would be interested in some interaction with those of you who have been observers and participants in efforts to address this issue. And we are especially interested in hearing the thoughts and opinions and questions of those students who are here in the audience. This would be a good time for me to acknowledge the volunteers who've worked so hard to make this year's forum possible. You're like the 800-pound gorilla, sir. You may sit anywhere you wish. You've been introduced. I want to acknowledge the volunteers. It's so important to us. The concentration coordinator for our program, Kevin Gully. Where's Kevin? In the back. My graduate assistant, Jillian Bauer. My course assistant, Annalisa Lieberman. And Ada Gianni, president of our co-sponsoring group for this forum, the SIPA Students of Color, and its members. We thank you. And I ask that they raise their hands so we can show their appreciation, our appreciation. Hands up. And now someone who is raising her hand, but you can't see it because she's in California right now, is Carol Banks. Carol is the one that When my wife says, well, can we do this or should we do the other, I say, ask Carol. She winds me up and points me daily. And so I'm so grateful for what she has done, not only for this forum, but in so many, many other ways. And those of you who have interacted with her know that I do not exaggerate. She's one of the most efficient, kind persons you ever want to meet. So Carol, we thank you. Now I have the privilege of presenting our keynote speaker to set the tone for our discussion. Pardon me. Rather than taking the time to recap the impressive credentials of our friend Mayor Morial as laid out in your printed program, I wish instead to focus on those aspects of his personal and professional history that have brought him and the organization he leads to their positions of leadership in the struggle against gun violence. The National Urban League, a nonpartisan civil rights institution based here in New York, is the oldest and largest community-based organization of its kind in the nation. Founded in 1910 for the purpose of combating racial discrimination against African Americans, it has focused its mission on enabling our communities to, and I quote, secure economic self-reliance, parity, power, and civil rights. With more than 100 local affiliates in 35 states, it has not wavered from its mission for nearly a century. And as President Obama said in addressing the organization's national convention just last year, the president said it has been inspiring people of every race and every religion and every walk of life to reach for the dream that lies at the heart of our founding. The promise that no matter who you are, no matter what you look like, no matter where you come from, no matter how modest your beginnings, no matter what the circumstances of your birth, here in America, you can make it if you try. And yet, the president went on, all this matters little if young people can't walk the streets of their neighborhoods safely, if we can't send our kids to school without worrying that they might get shot, if we can't go to the movies without fear of violence lurking in the shadows. The Urban League, as Marc Morial will tell you, has been a member of the National Coalition to Stop Gun Violence for more than a quarter century. The coalition, as some of you may know, advocates gun control. By virtue of the effectiveness of its programs to stem such violence, the National Urban League was chosen as the sole beneficiary of the proceeds from one of the earliest grassroots movements to stop the violence, with funding from nationwide events and an early hip-hop single that some of you may know called Self-Destruction. And it continues to stand solidly on the majority of the American people in its opposition to the maneuverings that give priority to the power of the gun lobby over the express wishes of the people. Last year's Forum on Voting Rights and Voter Suppression celebrated the historic significance and continued struggle of another of this nation's venerable organizations as it entered its second century of advocacy under the leadership of Columbia alumnus Benjamin Jealous. I'm happy that Hazel Dukes, who heads the NAACP's New York State Conference of Branches, is with us. She's my sister. In his 2010 keynote address, Ben Jealous allowed that after a century of struggle, the NAACP found itself in the midst of a presidential election where, and perhaps because, the candidate of one party was a progressive person of color still fighting the same fight for voting rights. Today we will hear from the head of another such institution, also still fighting the same fight, one who comes to us from the Big Easy, a city devastated by Hurricane Katrina, but where now the living is far easier for the millions of survivors who continue to call New Orleans home and the hundreds of thousands who visit each year, but perhaps not so easy for those who govern. As Mayor Marc Morial clearly made a remarkable impact on his city of New Orleans, employing strategies that grew city's economy and attractiveness for investments, improved its educational institutions and student performance on all levels, increased its employment and reduced its poverty level, and lowered its incidence of violent crime by more than half. As I had then police commissioner and later mayor of Houston, Dr. Lee Patrick Brown, as the architect of my Safe Streets, Safe City Cops and Kids initiative. Marc Morial had his police commissioner, Richard Pennington, and his chiefs hard at work on fighting crime. And Mayor Bloomberg has Ray Kelly and Phil Banks. But we all recognize that the jobs of these peacekeepers and law enforcers have been and continue to be made far more difficult by the ease with which guns are placed in the hands of criminals and those inclined toward the violent use of those weapons. Marc Morial knew instinctively and learned by governing that while gun ownership may be part of a cherished national heritage for some, AK-47s belong on the battlefield of war and not on the streets of our cities. And he has brought his formulas for success in dealing with the epidemic of violence in our cities to his work as president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors and now as at the National Urban League. We are honored that he has come to speak with us today about the threats to our ability to walk safe streets in this nation's cities. And I ask you to join me in welcoming my friend, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Urban League, Marc Morial.
First of all, good morning. Let me thank Mayor Dinkins for his great leadership. Mayor Dinkins has been, for me, a great role model and an inspiration. And the record has to clearly reflect, Mr. Mayor, that on your watch as mayor of this city, crime in New York City began to come down in those 36 final months. And while others may have taken the credit for the momentum that you created, we all know in our hearts and our minds that it was your innovation, your efforts, your insistence that did that. I want to thank you for bringing me here today to do this in your honor. And I want to thank Columbia University and SIPA for inviting a recovering country lawyer and a recovering politician from the Big Easy and the Bayou to come and just share with you today. I also want to thank Christina Ford. Christina, who's on the faculty now, was part of my team of lion tamers and alligator hunters who served in my administration during the comeback of New Orleans in the 1990s before Katrina took effect. Christina, thank you for your friendship and leadership. And certainly to Chief Banks and Mr. Feinblatt and all of the students and faculty here, thank you for having me. I want to begin with the word courage. We were witnesses to an act of cowardice by the Congress of the United States recently. And I'm not afraid to use those terms. I'm standing in front of a photo of the late Secretary General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld, who served from 1953 to 1961 as Secretary General. He lost his life in an untimely plane accident over in Africa. But very importantly, Secretary General Hammarskjöld stood up to the Soviet Union during the Cold War when they demanded his resignation as Secretary General. And in those times and in those days, to stand up to the Soviet Union, which was at the time and still is a member of the Security Council and therefore one of the Secretary General's employers, and say he would not resign, he would hold his job and continue to do his job, was in those days and at that time a great act of courage. I recently, and some of you all may have also seen the movie 42, which is the movie on the first year of Jackie Robinson's participation in Major League Baseball with the Brooklyn Dodgers. And that story, and I know that it is accurate because Rachel Robinson had her hands on every single line of that script. We witness the courage not only of Jackie Robinson, but of Branch Rickey, the courage of a number of eventually Jackie's own teammates in standing up to racial taunts, to great threats, to challenges in those times. Whereas right here today, in 2013, we just witnessed, now this has to absolutely be explained, right? The United States Senate refused to even vote, to have a vote on the merits. Stay with me, public policy students. Vote to have a vote on the merits, because it wasn't a vote on the merits. It was a vote on this old thing called the filibuster. And notwithstanding the fact that a majority, overwhelmingly, of American people were prepared to support a modest, I call it gun safety. Gun safety, say gun safety. We're going to stop using the term gun control. We're going to use the term gun safety, because the objective is not to control, the objective is safe, to make our communities safe. We witness the United States Senate refusing to go along. Refusing to go along, therefore indicating that it was in the grips of whatever powerful special interest groups some of them may have been afraid of. When the two of the most conservative members of each party's caucus could come together and come up with a provision and negotiate it in the spirit of compromise, and we still saw the United States Senate refuse to go along. To me, it is an indication of simply the lack of courage. Courage. You can have all the intelligence, all of the sophisticated understanding of public policy. You can have all the good intentions, but like the lion in The Wizard of Oz, right? You just need a little courage. And this United States Senate and those who didn't turn their back on the people of this nation. Courage. A couple of observations about how to make this a safer nation and how to make this our cities safer and our communities safer are these. Number one, gun safety is important, but it alone is not enough. Gun safety is important, but it alone is not enough. I want to tell you about my personal journey and my personal advocacy and why I'm so passionate about gun safety. When I was in 4th grade, my very best friend lost his life in a gun accident. Now, this was not, he was my best friend, but here are the circumstances. When I started school in 1963, it was the second years that the schools were integrated in New Orleans. And I lived over here, and we had to travel into a predominantly, exclusively white neighborhood to attend school. In 2nd grade, I became very good friends with another boy who happened to be white. And in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade, he would travel from his neighborhood to my house to play with me, and I would travel from my neighborhood to his house to play with him. When I went into his neighborhood, I was taunted by some of his friends. When he came into my neighborhood, he was taunted by some of my friends. And a bond ensued. And he lost his life due to a gun accident. When I was in 4th or 5th grade, for a student project, I wrote a paper on what I called at the time, don't know where it came from, weapons mania. And mind you, these are the 1960s. After John Kennedy had been killed, after Medgar Evers had been killed, when the television each and every night carried stories about the Vietnam War. And this was the 1960s, when I was in 4th grade, when Dr. Martin Luther King was killed. And just 2 months later, Robert F. Kennedy was killed. And when it strikes you on a personal level, as close as that when you are a very young person, those types of things stay with you, because a friend of mine was taken away. The only thing I ask the members of the United States Senate is, how can you look into the eyes of the parents of the children in Newtown? How, and maybe the members of Congress, Mr. Mayor, don't do what we do as mayors when we go to the funerals of strangers, when we're called on to help to pay for the funerals of people in the community who can't afford it, who lose their lives. Maybe the members of Congress have become, some of them have become so detached from the experiences of modern America, big towns and small towns, and the suburbs and the urban communities. Aurora was the suburbs. Newtown fit the picture of a postcard somewhere in a perfect community. Yet every night in Brooklyn, on the south side of Chicago, in Baltimore, in the 9th Ward of my hometown, New Orleans, in Los Angeles, there's gun violence that's taking place. It took these tremendous upheavals, these life-shattering events, these front-page news stories, to even compel the United States Senate to move to where it has moved. Now here's who we are as a nation. 30,000 firearms deaths each and every year. Madison Square Garden has 19,500 seats. More people die due to firearm deaths each year than can fill up Madison Square Garden 1.5 times. 12,000 of them are homicides. 17,000 of them are suicides. And then the number wounded is 100,000 strong. We have a violence challenge in America today, a serious and significant violence challenge in America today. 450,000 crimes taking place, chief, with guns. The number of mass shootings, that's 4 more victims, since 1982, 61 in the United States of America. More Americans die in gun homicides and suicides in 6 months than have died in the last 25 years from all the wars and all the terrorist attacks combined. I'm shooting these numbers at all of you with the hope that you'll grasp onto some of these numbers to recognize that this is not an insignificant problem, that this is not something that just happens every once in a while. Not something that just happens in the big cities of America or only in Brooklyn or an occasional Aurora. That this is a problem that affects the very essence of who we are as a country and as a nation. Gun safety legislation, like the kind adopted by this state, or like Maryland, Governors Cuomo and O'Malley, move in the right direction, make a powerful statement. Some may argue, well, I don't know if it's going to work. My answer to them is, well, you come up with another idea. I'm going to challenge you to do something, because doing nothing is absolutely unacceptable. Right here in this city, the mayor of this city has done something that is courageous. He's put his credibility and weight and his resources behind passing gun safety legislation. When I was mayor of New Orleans, we had a tremendous, unfortunate killing of a very popular local gospel singer by the name of Raymond Miles. Raymond Miles was a combination of Hezekiah Walker and Little Richard. He was flamboyant, he was exciting, he was always there for me, and he lost his life in 1998. At that time, mayors had been meeting for about a year. Myself, Ed Rendell, Richard Daley, under the auspices, Mr. Mayor, of the United States Conference of Mayors, because we were looking for ways to advance the agenda of gun safety. And we came up with a novel idea. And that novel idea was to use the product liability laws to challenge the gun manufacturers in the courts. That effort, which operated very quietly for a year, took hold when I decided to break ranks with the group. Because the group was divided, we had come up with the idea that on one single day we should all file suits simultaneously across the country. And there were some of us who said, let's go. And there were some who said, let's wait. And there were some who said, well, I may have to jump off this bus while it's moving. And I broke ranks, and then a day later, Richard Daley broke ranks, and we filed product liability lawsuits challenging the design and the manufacture of guns. This is at a time when the assault weapons ban was in place, to challenge to try to take another step. Did I know what I was getting myself into? I felt the wrath of the National Rifle Association, the Gun Manufacturers Association of America, absolutely immediately. The gun manufacturers, who had planned their trade show in New Orleans 2 years hence, decided that they were going to publicly say that if I didn't drop my lawsuit, they were going to boycott New Orleans and any city that had the courage and conviction to file suit against the gun manufacturers would also be subjected to the same kind of boycott. Did I drop my lawsuit? No. Did they boycott New Orleans? No. But I got probably 200,000 pieces of mail from all across the country. I didn't know people loved me in Wyoming, in Idaho, in Utah, and all of these places where I got all of these form letters. This is before emails. Form letters saying how silly our lawsuit was and we needed to stop it or we'll never visit New Orleans again. I learned that the advocacy groups that support the Second Amendment and gun rights are extremely influential and strong, and not to be laughed at, not to be mocked. to certainly understand their tremendous power and their ability. And I challenged them, and they challenged me, which is why it is so positive today to see Mayor Bloomberg with the ability and the wherewithal and the conviction to push back against that in a very important way to organize this generation's mayors to do it. So gun safety laws, gun safety legislation does and can make a difference. We've had more incidents with assault weapons since the assault weapon ban has expired than we had before the assault weapon ban expired. That's number one. But then number two, and very critically and importantly, is what gives rise in this very nation to this great sense somehow, this, yes, culture and instinct and predisposition towards violence. And that could be the subject of a discussion all by itself. But here are a couple of observations. First of all, we have never done enough in this nation to invest in our young people. Never done enough to invest in our young people. When I took over New Orleans in 1994, we were leading the nation in per capita murders each and every year. And we were also leading the nation in per capita civil rights complaints against our police department in addition to that. We had a serious, serious problem. So we set out to try to do something about it. And what we decided to do, and I want to use these examples because I'm not going to suggest to you that the examples of New Orleans fit perfectly with any other community. I think every city's got to decide, define, determine, and design the strategies that will work for it. So we did a number of things. First, we imposed the toughest juvenile curfew in the nation in 1994, where kids under the age of 16 had to be off the streets at 8 p.m. Now, mind you, I'm coming to City Hall after serving on the board of the Louisiana ACLU. I'm coming to City Hall after a distinguished record as a civil rights lawyer, and I am imposing the toughest curfew in the nation. And one of my good friends, who was a general counsel of the ACLU, called me up, came into my office and said, you know, we're planning to file a lawsuit against you. He says, but I have one problem. My problem is if I file this lawsuit, my wife will put me out the house. But we did something to make this curfew different. Children who were picked up were not brought to a booking facility, not brought to a precinct, not brought to a court, not brought to a police station. We set up a curfew center. The curfew center was managed by a faith-based organization. We had one aim with the curfew center, and that was to call up the parents and have them come to pick up their children. And no child would have a record if they were picked up unless they were previously wanted on an outstanding warrant. At the curfew center, we hired social workers, psychologists, and professionals. Would you know that on any given night, we could not get in touch with 10% of the parents? We had children who were raising themselves. So we imposed the toughest curfew in the nation. Secondly, we decided that we were going to I'm using the term overinvest in youth programs and in young people. So we created, with public and private dollars, 50 free summer camps managed by the city for kids between 7 and 14 years of age. We created 5,000 summer jobs that we gave out by way of a public lottery for any child that wanted to work during the summer between the ages of 14 and 19. We evaluated, looking at some of the things that were done in New York, and developed a police reform effort that combined a larger police department, higher pay, zero tolerance for corruption and civil rights violations, and we put it into effect. We used the computerized system called ComStat as the backbone of everything that we were trying to do. And we did police reform in an outstanding way. 6 years later, New Orleans led the nation in the rate of decline in violent crime 4 years in a row. The number of civil rights complaints virtually went down to an infinitesimal amount because we stressed in remaking the police department engagement between the police and the community. We wanted our frontline commanders, we wanted them in churches, we wanted them in community groups, we wanted them speaking before business and labor organizations. We wanted them to be visible and known to try to create a different level of trust between the community and the police department. And we did that. And then we championed gun safety in the ways in which I described. We did a number of things simultaneously in conjunction with each other. And I said to the community that it's going to take a combination of things for us to be able to make a community safe. All too often, and this is one of my concerns about the gun safety debate, it is absolutely important that even though the Congress of the United States and the United States Senate did not vote favorably, I hope that Harry Reid makes them vote every Friday at high noon. Bring it up once, twice, 3, 4, 5, 6, however many times it takes to dramatize how out of touch some members are with the popular will of the people of the United States. So before we go to questions, I want to just certainly leave you with what I began with, and that is the word courage. Because I believe that leaders need courage and conviction. Now, it does take courage sometimes to go against the popular will. It does take courage sometimes to do things that are sensible and make common sense. But I'll say to the public policy students here, maybe courage is something that can't be taught in a classroom, can't be learned from a book, can't be absorbed from the air that we breathe. But great leaders, whether it's Dag Hammarskjöld, whether it's Jackie Robinson, whether it's what Michael Bloomberg is doing today on guns, whether it is Martin Luther King or John F. Kennedy or Robert F. Kennedy, or any of the great leaders and icons of the 20th century, they had one thing. They had this innate sense of courage and conviction, which drove them, which powered them. And safety and safer cities requires a sense of courage. I knew that when I said, let's have curfew, a strong curfew, The first group of people that I met with was a room of 100 ministers. And I said to them, this is your mama's rule. Because in the old days, you had to come in when the street lights went on. And we were trying to reimpose the community standard. And I asked them, we had an entire communications effort, that's what it's called now, communications effort, to try to get the community to reinforce voluntary compliance in a significant way. So I spent a tremendous amount of time moving around the community, trying to encourage voluntary compliance, and the parents absolutely loved it because it strengthened their hand in raising their children. It took, for me, with a background as a civil rights and civil liberties lawyer, a little bit of running against the grain. But had I just done a curfew, and we hadn't done summer jobs, and we hadn't done investment in youth, we would have had an incomplete. So I told those in the community who said, let's just double the size of the police department. Let's just get more aggressive. I said, we need to do some of what you're saying, but I need to know, will you support these other two tenets of this program? And the same thing to the others who supported the other two tenets. And I said, if we come together, if we build a bridge, if everybody yields just a bit, we can make the city safer, and the rest, indeed, is history. One last word about the work of the National Urban League. We are going to strongly support efforts in the Congress to pass gun safety legislation. But let's face it, folks, we need to go beyond just comprehensive background checks. We need bans on assault weapons. Yes, we do. We need a more aggressive effort to deal with the mental health challenges that we have. We need to do things, take the New York law and make it national law. And that would indeed make a difference. So thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the 16th Annual Dinkins Policy Forum. I was here for the fourth one, 1998. The title then was Culture and Tourism. It was a sweeter day. At the time, Esther Fuchs wrote to me a little note afterwards, and she said, my presentation was terrific, and many people asked me why you weren't in New York, and reportedly, Mayor Dinkins said to someone, why does New Orleans get her? Why isn't she in New York? You may or may not have said that, but I'm taking that it was true. But here's the reason. The reason was I was working for Mayor Morial in New Orleans, and you couldn't have torn me away. And I think you showed that, Mark. He showed many things today, and my role here is simply to give you all a chance to take a deep breath, and my students, at least, to formulate some questions to ask Mark. But let me tell you a couple of observations I had. One of the things that's very interesting, I had a copy of this speech before Mark came. He was sitting beside me when Mayor Dinkins asked who this was. You didn't know who it was. Esther knew who it was. But what you did know was the story of Dog Hammarskjöld, which you put into your speech. And that is a hallmark, Mark Morial, and the reason that I couldn't be dragged away. The other thing that I hope that you all noted in this, because Mark told you a lot about some tough people to deal with. There's a quote from Nietzsche, whoever battles with monsters had better see that it does not turn him into a monster. And you can see that that's true of Mark. Mark is ever hopeful of people. He's not telling you, for instance, that the senators in Congress who couldn't vote were monstrous. He's just saying they need courage. And that's something that someone can gain if they look within themselves. And that, to me, is a hallmark of public policy. The other thing is, when Mark told you all the things that he tried to do when we needed to do something about the terrible crime problem in New Orleans, there were many things he tried. Apparently you got a little help from the ACLU lawyer's wife that you could help. But what I realize is that there is an addictive nature of incompletion and risk, that public policy isn't about finding the single solution that's going to work, as you said, Mayor Morial. What worked in New Orleans probably has to be tailored to other places. But it is addictive to try to figure out what all we can do and to understand that it's necessarily going to be incomplete because people have ideas that you haven't recognized before you took them on. So I found it all very inspiring. I know a question that many of my students ask, Mr. Mayor, that I hope one of them asks, but in case they're shy, I'll ask you, which is they worry about how you sustain your interest in doing something like working against gun control or working for gun safety and against gun violence when you are frustrated. How do you keep persevering? That's their primary question as young graduate students. And so I'll let you start by answering that question.
Thank you, Christina. That's a hard question, and I don't know the answer. How do you sustain yourself? I think you sustain yourself because when you fight battles for which you have conviction, a sense of conviction and purpose and reality. But, you know, the gun safety debate has ebbed and flowed in the United States. After the assassinations in the 1960s, there was greater public support and effort to create new gun safety laws at the federal level. Then there was an effort in the 1980s when crime and violence, and then you had Columbine, were much more important. After the awful tragedy of 9/11, the nation became much more focused on homeland security and terrorism, and you heard very, very little. And then it bounced back on to the scene in a very big way with the tragedies that took place last year. Even when the tragedy with Gabby Giffords took place, there wasn't the same outcry as there was at Sandy Hook in Newtown. So these efforts ebb and they flow, and everything sort of comes back full circle. But I think at the end of the day, my life and my view and my feeling and my compassion is driven very much by what happened to me when I was a very young boy. And it creates a sense of conviction and a sense of purpose. And if you find that sense of conviction and purpose around an issue, you'll always want to fight. And if you're frustrated, you'll be frustrated for a minute and then come right back.
Surely one of y'all has a question.
Questions?
It doesn't have to be my students. Anybody else can ask a question also.
If this was a room of law students, every hand would have went up, right? Questions? Comments or advice? Yes, sir.
Their mic is coming to you.
No, I was interested in what you said about courage, because you said that it's not something students can learn in the classroom, that all these leaders have it, but they have it innately. So what do you suggest? How do you develop this courage? Where do you get it from? And also, I think your colleague on the side mentioned something about the addictiveness of it. And so, do you think it's addictive?
It may not be innate. I think you do gain it from a sense of experience. But I think deep down, everybody's got conviction and courage. It comes to the surface at different times and based on different circumstances in your life. And sometimes you should let your conviction and your feelings bubble to the surface, come to the top, be willing to fight. And I think you have to sustain you if you want to do public policy and you want to operate. We have a dynamic society where we love to debate and discuss everything. There's no such thing as a universal truth. There's no such thing as something that's universally accepted. But man, when you get to 85% on background checks, that was pretty close to universal consensus as you'll get. So you have to prepare yourself in what you do in public policy and public administration for the sense that you're going to say something and someone's going to disagree with it. You're going to say something and somebody's going to challenge it. They're going to oppose it. They may oppose your motives. They may oppose the common sense of what you are suggesting, the efficacy of what you're doing. I'm a lawyer by training, and one of the things law teaches you is how to operate in an adversarial environment. And I realized later on, I was a much more effective public official because I had spent 10 years talking to juries, debating with judges, learning how to operate on my feet than any experience I could have had any other way. But I do believe you have to prepare yourself. That's why I'm a big believer, speaking to the professors here, that creating opportunities for your students to present orally, standing on their feet, on different sides of issues, in teams, is a very significant part of your learning. What you do a lot now is you present in the professional realm. People use PowerPoints, they do short form presentations, they've got to convince a small group. You can learn that. Sometimes in education, written communication is critically important. But verbal communication combined with written communication. People will come to brief me sometimes, and I'll say, before I read the memo, what's your recommendation? And some people will stumble because they'll say, well, what's my recommendation? Okay, let me tell you what my recommendation is. And I said, and who will oppose this? For what reasons? Very simply, tell me what's in here. I will read this. So I think that in terms of helping people find their courage is the ability to present on an issue where you've got somebody on the other side who might challenge it, who might have a different position, and it makes you sharpen your arguments. And sometimes it brings out your strengths.
One over here. Where is the mic?
Thanks very much for your speech. Really appreciate it. In the context of a day like today where the U.S. Congress is failing to respond to the will of the people as you've laid out here, what, short of voting them out of office, how can we go about holding them accountable for what the will of the people really is, and what kind of forums are available to really, make the voices of the American people heard? Is the Conference of Mayors a good forum for that, or what other suggestions might you have?
I tell you what, and I really believe this, and so let me make an observation on New York politics, right? Because I came here 10 years ago. I'm shocked at the low voter participation levels in New York City. Shocked by it. Where I'm from, when we had local elections, 80% of the people would turn out. And it would be a passionate battle with everyone in on the act. Everyone had a position. They had candidates. Now, it isn't that way back home as much. The turnout levels are now in the 50s, high 40s. If people believe it's not acceptable to have a consumer mentality about voting. What's a consumer mentality? If I walk into the store to buy a tie and I don't see a tie I like, I walk out. It's not acceptable to vote by not voting. To say, I'm voting for none of the above by not voting. And civic engagement, what civic engagement will do, higher voter turnout and participation will increase participation by young people. It'll increase participation by communities of color. It'll increase participation by people who don't necessarily follow politics each and every day. And they're not glued to the cable TV. They're not looking at every blog post. Participation levels are a problem in the United States in many, many places. New York is interesting. the biggest state, one of the largest states in the union. One of the things that would increase voting participation here in New York is if it were less expensive to run for office. I think there's something to be said about open primaries. I'm not endorsing it here, but we have it in Louisiana. And I think there's also something to be said about making it easier for people to participate, shorter lines, more precincts, easier access to the ballot box. We've got to do something about voting participation. A cynical public allows members of Congress, people who serve in elected office, to know before the election even happens who's going to participate based on historical trends. And then they're going to position their politics towards those who historically participate. But the other thing you can do, what's your name? Zoe. What is it? Zoe. Zoe. So Zoe should run for Congress.
Mr. Mayor, I have been told that that time is up. I appreciate all of you coming and listening to Mayor Morial. The one thing I want you to know, this goes to frustration and perseverance, is that you can hear a mayor sum up what he has done, the way that Marc did about trying to bring down the crime in his city, and he succeeded. He brought it down. And it sounds, in a way, as if the policies that he described were such common sense that it was easy to get them passed. Of course, it wasn't. And that's one of the things that's very interesting about public policy and why you stay in it. And it's where courage comes from, that you realize this is a brilliant idea, but I have to find a way to convince people to it. But thank you very much for listening, and we'll go on to the next forum.